Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at topic 10.1. This corresponds to pages 358 to 365 in your textbook. We'll be taking a look at Native American relations with the American government and how the two sides kind of went back and forth. Kind of take a look at where Native Americans could and should live. Obviously, it's going to be against their wishes in many cases that they're going to be forced to trek to faraway unknown places. As we move forward, you're going to get a better understanding of how Native Americans and white settlers kind of, differed on how to best use the land. We'll look at the inevitable conflicts between the whites who would move into Native American territory, almost seen as invaders on the part of Native Americans. We'll see the wars with Native Americans and the effectiveness of the government's Americanization and reservation policies towards American Indians. The first reading was through cultures and how they were forced to adapt against their willingness. In 1787, the Constitution granted sole power for regulating trade with Native Americans to the federal government. How did this impact relationships with Native Americans? This put a tremendous strain on our relationship with Native Americans. Native Americans do not like to be dictated to by the American government. They wanted autonomy or their freedom to make their own decisions. 2, how did the United States government policy towards Native Americans change between the early 1800s and then the period of time around the Civil War? What caused this change? In the earlier 1800s, the United States government set aside Indian territory in the Great Plains west of the mighty Mississippi, the Mississippi River, moved many Native Americans to the eastern seaboard to that territory. So anybody who was living basically in the original 13 colonies, keep in mind that when Americans and the British settlers first came to America, they began slowly but surely pushing Native Americans further and further away from the East Coast. The government protected Indian territory, for the most part, by keeping white settlers out of the new territory west of the Mississippi. But by the 1850s, remember we had studied the 49ers who had moved out west in search of gold. So by the 1850s, many Americans had found out about the discovery of gold and silver. We began to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. As the railroad began to move west, so too did white settlers. As they moved west of the original Indian territory, they're running into the groups of Native Americans who had thought that territory was going to be left open for them. During the Civil War, there were several conflicts between Americans and Native Americans. By the end of the Civil War, where did Native Americans live? Around 250,000 of them lived in the region west of the Mississippi, referred to as the Great American Desert. Compare and contrast the way of life of different tribes of Native Americans during this period of time. Native Americans embraced many different belief systems, languages, and ways of life. Geography impacted the cultural diversity of Native Americans. In the Pacific Northwest, several different tribes benefited from the abundant supplies of fish and forest animals. A lot of them were hunters, gatherers, and went fishing. In the more arid lands, the drier areas of New Mexico and Arizona, the Pueblos irrigated land to grow cotton, beans, and squash. They built adobe homes high in the cliffs to protect themselves from aggressive neighbors. The more mobile Navajos lived in a hogan. Hogans were homes made of mud that could be easily moved from place to place. The Plains Indians, including the Sioux, Blackfeet, Crows, were expert horsemen and hunters, as well as the Cheyenne and the Comanches. The millions of buffalo that roamed the plains provided a rich source for lodging, clothing, food, and tools. 5, how did Native American and American views on nature differ? How did this impact their relationship? Indian culture shared a common thread as they saw themselves as part of nature. So for many Native Americans, they really looked out for nature. They respected nature and the natural world. They only used what they absolutely needed. They never wasted. They didn't kill for sport. They killed out of necessity. And when they did kill, they actually used every aspect of the animal, from the fur to the meat to the bones, for tools and weapons. Some white settlers valued and respected nature, but also they viewed the land as a resource that could be used to produce wealth. So we had kind of a conflict here of Native Americans preserving the land, Americans who want to profit from the land. By the late 1860s, many Native Americans had been placed on reservations. Reservations are specific areas that the government set aside for Native American use. The change in their demographic patterns, a direct result of being forced to migrate to reservations, made the previous way of life difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. Native Americans often faced poverty and the loss of their traditional ways of life on reservations. Reservations, too, were often the most horrid, dry, arid land in America, land that the white settlers did not want, and they kind of just discarded that land and then made it available for Native Americans. 7, why does the text include information about the ways in which hunters and tourists use the buffalo? Well, the information about the buffalo illustrates one of the pressures that white settlers placed on Native Americans. The indiscriminate slaughter of the buffalo threatened the survival of the Plains Indians, who ate buffalo meat, made clothing and shelter from the buffalo hide, and carved tools from buffalo horns and bone. Details about the wasting of the buffalo meat and hide also help to illustrate the cultural class between Native American cultures and non-Native cultures. Killing the buffalo for sport was shocking to Native Americans, for whom the buffalo was a revered animal. Settlers and Native Americans collide. Here's a quote from the New York Tribune in 1867. If you strike off into the broad, free West and make yourself a farm from Uncle Sam's generous domain, you will crowd nobody, starve nobody, and neither you nor your children need evermore beg. Horace Greeley tried to, in his newspaper, convince Americans to move west. So there was a lot of promotion and advertisement and articles in the New York Tribune that kind of glamorized and kind of idealized the westward territory. So your question here for 8, analyze the excerpt from the newspaper. Which word and phrases you think would have been especially persuasive to people of that time? The words broad and free paint a positive picture of the West that would probably have appealed to people who were looking for a fresh start or for land of their own. The promise that neither you nor your children need evermore beg. This is kind of appealing, especially to the lower class within society who might be struggling. Very powerful, might have appealed, especially during difficult economic times, because you would then perhaps have an opportunity to improve your life. There's a picture of Horace Greeley there. The one thing that Greeley did ignore, of course, was the fact that Native Americans inhabited half of the area of the United States. Indians often fought to retain or regain whatever they could. So next, we're going to start looking at some of the conflicts between Native Americans and white settlers. What triggered the Sand Creek Massacre? How did the Plains Indians respond to the attack? Battle between the Sioux and the United States government heightened tension and distrust between Native Americans and settlers. When American troops came upon the Cheyenne and the Arapaho Indians at Sand Creek, the troops opened fire. Even though the commander of the nearby Fort Lyons had given the Indians permission to stay at the Sand Creek temporarily. So here's some hypocrisy here and some conflict in terms of even American leadership. Some who were a little more compassionate and understanding, and others who were much more aggressive towards Native Americans. So Native Americans, in many cases, did not know what to even believe. Plains Indians responded by joining forces against the settlers, and you can see in this painting here the Native American teepees and the American military, the cavalry going in there to attack the Native Americans by horseback. After the Civil War ended, what happened out west regarding Native Americans? Regiments of Union troops, white African Americans alike, were sent to the west to bring peace to the plains. Recruitment posters for volunteer cavalry members promised the soldiers could claim any horse or other plunder that they steal from Native Americans. The federal government asserted that the troops were needed to maintain order. 12. What did the government-appointed United States Indian Peace Commission conclude about how peace between whites and Native Americans could occur? It concluded that lasting peace would only come if Native Americans settled on farms and reservations and adopted to the white way of life. One of the more significant treaties that you should be familiar with during this period of time was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The government agreed not to build the road through Sioux territory and to abandon 3 forts in Sioux areas. This treaty included the Black Hills and the Sioux Reservation, and it also promised a school and another communal building for the Sioux. The Sioux and other Native Americans who signed the treaty agreed to live on a reservation until federal supervision with support from the federal government. So they're kind of making some agreement there, hoping the Americans would stick to that agreement. Somewhat of a compromise, at least here with the Fort Laramie Treaty. Not going to provide any long-lasting peace, however, as we're going to see. The statements of Chief Pierpont made about the Canadian government's treatment of the Native Americans. Could the same criticism of the treatment of Native Americans be made against American government officials? So to gain control of land, whites made promises to us while forcing us to live on small reservations. These are kind of the words of the chief. Soon the promises grew smaller, and whites failed to keep even half of those smaller promises. So yes, the same criticisms can be made about the American government because it also relegated Native Americans to smaller and smaller pieces of land. And even that land that they received was kind of the barren and dry land that I had mentioned earlier. Textbook also mentioned that many Indian agents in the United States stole money and supplies that were meant to be given to Native Americans. So all of that was very problematic during this period of time. The Indian Wars describe the conditions facing Native Americans that had all the ingredients for tragedy. Indians were confined to isolated areas which were regularly ravaged by poverty and disease. The government, intentionally or not, failed to live up to many of the promises made to various groups of Native Americans. Frustrations, particularly among young warriors, turned to violence. Guns replaced treaties as the government defeated Native Americans who were openly rebelling. Explain the events that led to the Long Walk of Navajos in 1863. In 1863, the government sent the famous frontiersman Kit Carson to subdue the Navajos who were fighting to protect the southwestern homeland. After Carson's forces destroyed their homes, crops, and livestock, about 2/3 of the 12,000 Navajos surrendered in 1864. Carson then sent them on a 300-mile forced march known as the Long Walk to a reservation in what is now eastern New Mexico. After the Navajo made the Long Walk, the United States government forced them to live on a reservation with the Apaches, who were their enemies. 17. How did the Black Hills Gold Rush of 1875 impact relations with the Sioux living here in the Dakotas and neighboring Montana? What did the Sioux do? Gold drew prospectors onto Sioux hunting grounds, which angered the Sioux. They believed this area was supposed to be protected by the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. The Sioux, led by their chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, assembled to drive out the whites. The U.S. Army sent in their own troops to counter the Native Americans. This is going to take us to one of the more famous battles of this period of time, the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we're just going to watch a short clip on the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then we'll go through the remaining questions.
It's one of the most crushing defeats in American history. Custer's last stand. June 25th, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and over 600 troopers of the 7th United States Cavalry arrive in the Little Bighorn Valley of southern Montana. The cavalry has come to subdue a village of defiant Indians. Thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne under the leadership of the great holy man, Sitting Bull. For a century, the United States has pushed the frontier west, herding tribe after tribe onto agencies or reservations. The Sioux and the Cheyenne don't want to give up their land on the northern plains. These last defiant Indians gather into a colossal wandering village. In the spring of 1876, the village arrives on the plains of Montana.
The village was always on the move. They knew the army was out after them. And to the United States Army, to capture a fleeing village was an impossible task.
Custer follows Sitting Bull's path west across the Wolf Mountains. On the other side, the Indian village stands on the banks of a slender river. The Indians call it the Greasy Grass. The Army calls it the Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25th, Custer and his troops arrive in a treacherous landscape carved up into hidden channels and ravines. Perfect cover for fighters who know its contours. Deadly for the soldiers who don't. Around noon, Custer makes what many believe is his fatal mistake. He divides his forces into 3 separate columns. Custer heads up the bluffs along the river to attack from the north. It's his first clear look at the size of the village. He realizes he doesn't have enough troops to do the job. He sends a rider south with a note calling for more men and more ammo.
It's important to keep in mind that no one had any idea of how many Indians there would be. They simply had no idea.
Indians are surrounding Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his battalion. Survivors are struggling to join up with other troopers on nearby high ground. A spot now called Last Stand Hill.
The tables are turning for Custer. He's no longer the attacker, he's being attacked. Decides to take this high hill, which we call Last Stand Hill today. All the soldiers killed their horses to hide behind. All the warriors said was they got close to this hill, they arched their arrows high into the sky, having those arrows come down behind those dead horses. They said, we rained arrows down on those men. Their shots quit coming. And we rushed up and we killed them all.
Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and over 200 of his men annihilated in a defeat that devastated America in 1876.
Obviously, we had some technical difficulties with that film clip there. The film clip link is posted in my YouTube chapter 10, if you want to watch that full clip, but you did get some basic idea of what it looked like in terms of the mountains and how Custer had made some mistakes there. So there for number 18, Colonel Custer rushed ahead of the other columns of American cavalry members, arrived a day ahead of his main force. Near the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana, Custer and his force of about 250 men unexpectedly came upon the group of around 2,000 Indians. Crazy Horse led the charge at what became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. He killed Custer and all his men. This is remembered as Custer's last stand. You can see here how overwhelmed Custer's forces are. They're getting cut down one by one until eventually they're all killed. Custer's pictured here. 19, why do you think the United States government found the ghost dance revival threatening? The government feared the revival would unite different Native American nations together and motivate a rebellion. In addition, some settlers may have been fearful of the supernatural force of the ghost dance, which was designed to banish white settlers and restore buffalo to the plains. In 1890, to curtail ghost dance activities, what did the government order? Government ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull. In the confrontation to arrest Sitting Bull, he, along with many other Native Americans, were killed. The cavalry pushed others to Wounded Knee in present-day South Dakota. Having been partially disarmed by U.S. troops, the Sioux were badly outgunned in the fight that followed. In the end, more than 100 men, women, and children died. The end of the Ghost Dance War at Wounded Knee also marked the end of major Indian resistance to white expansion and a large-scale resistance to Indian policies by the United States government. The government encourages assimilation. Making Indians live in confined areas as wards of the government was costly in terms of human and economic terms. Policymakers hoped that the buffalo became extinct. Indians would then become farmers and be assimilated into national life by adopting traditional white ways. List the goals and the impact of the Americanization movement in 1871. Congress had passed a law stating that no Indian nation or tribe within the United States would be recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty. Indians were now to be dealt with as individuals. One reason for the change was to weaken Native Americans' tribal cultures. List the provisions of the Dawes Act, also remembered as the Dawes General Allotment Act or Dawes Sovereignty Act. Passed by Congress in 1887 and encouraged Indians to become private property owners and farmers. The Dawes Act ended the reservation's tribal land holding system. Each Indian family was allotted or assigned 160 acres of the tribe's reservation to own as farmstead. The size of the allotments were based on the Eastern experience of how much land was needed to support a family. In the arid West, however, the allotment was often not big enough. Lesson reflection. In your opinion, what was the most significant effect of the Indian Wars on Native Americans? Most significant effect was that Native American cultures were decimated. Though Native Americans tried to protect their traditions, the displacement of the people from their land and their loss of important leaders took their toll. Other than the loss of life, which Native Americans also suffered, there can be no greater loss than the wiping out of a people's culture and way of life. That's it for 10.1. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussions here on the Native Americans.